Hey everyone, thanks a lot for joining us. Today we have Josh from American Lease. Josh, thanks a lot for being here.
Pleasure, Dawood. Good to speak to you.
Good to speak to you as well as always. And so before we get started, I know a lot of people will tune into this podcast thinking, oh, this is just about Fisker and American Lease and all the news around that. We're going to touch on that briefly, but we're also going to expand beyond that. And I think it's maybe a story that's not as well covered and is probably as, if not more interesting. So just before we get started, I know a lot of people in New York will know what American Lease is. Can you just explain, like, what is American Lease? What do you guys do? Are you just New York City focused? I think people might be interested to understand, what the company's about.
Sure. So for now, we are strictly in New York City, and we are a rental car provider for the for-hire vehicle industry. So people that drive Uber, Lyft, or any other livery bases that don't have their own vehicle, they'll come and they'll rent a car from us in a nutshell.
Yeah, and you've been doing this even before the rise of Uber and Lyft. I think that's an important point. Like the
Okay.
company has existed for, in New York City for I think 2 decades or something like
Correct.
that.
American Lease was formed right around 2004, which was obviously before my time with the company,
Yeah.
but this predates all of the app-based TNCs, and this started really with livery and luxury base at the time financing and lease to own, and then as the market demands shifted, it turned into really more of a pure rental operation.
And then, and the last question I ask you just on background is what's, just the audience might be interested. What's your background? Like how long have you been in the fleet business?
Sure.
Yeah.
I started with the TLC business in 2014. I founded Fast Track Mobility, which eventually was absorbed by Buggy, Voyager, VGM. And then post sale, I came and joined the team at American Lease. I'd known the guys through the industry for many years, and we've been working together since 2023, 22.
Yeah, so you're kind of a OG in this fleet industry, if you want to call it like that. You've been at especially with the rise of Uber and Lyft. And
Right.
so, yeah.
That's really when I got involved, when the TNCs came into the market and things started to grow explosively. So yeah, I've been along for that ride and the total shift in the market.
Yeah, no, that makes, that's super interesting. And so, okay, so like I said, I think a lot of people who are tuning into this thinking, okay, this is just going to be another rehash of what's Fisker about, what happened there. Now, obviously, we'll touch on that, but I think an important part of this whole thing is this is beyond just a Fisker bet. This is an EV story. We'll get into, you also have, built a very large Toyota BZ fleet, which I think is very interesting. It could be the largest in the country, potentially. And so I think the first place to start, because it's very specific, is why make such a huge EV bet, whether it's between the Fiskers and the Toyotas. And I guess I'll kind of set up the question a little bit. For people who are not from New York City, there's a thing called the Green Rides Initiative. And the Green Rides Initiative is basically going to require incrementally 100% of all Uber and Lyft trips be dispatched to either a wheelchair accessible vehicle, a Wave, or an electric vehicle, or zero emission if there's another technology, but basically an EV and Wave mandate. And so is it fair to me to say a big part of the Fisker bet and just the general EV bet you guys are making relates to that mandate, or was this something separately that you guys were anyways going to do?
No, so this is directly correlated to the mandate. Even though New York, it's improving, but New York really hasn't been equipped to handle commercial electric vehicle fleets as far as charging infrastructure. It's starting to catch up now. There are more and more chargers that are coming online, but we do have the Green Rides Initiative that's going to take effect in 2030. There's a ramp up, assuming that the schedule stays as the TLC announced it. There is a ramp over the next 4 years where it goes from 10% of rides, 20% of rides, 30%, eventually 80% of rides, I think, are scheduled to be EV only by 2029. Because of COVID, the fleet refresh cycle really kind of fell behind at American Lease because there were no new cars available on the market. So over the past 12 months, 16 months, we've aggressively been pulling out some of the older models that were aged and high mileage and starting to become inefficient as they were driving around and things were breaking on them. So then we got into the question of what should be the vehicle that we're investing in. We try to always have a 4 to 7 year shelf life on vehicles in the TLC industry. That's pretty much a standard goal for all fleets. And we didn't want to invest too heavily in cars that would be really aged out halfway through their life cycle. So we actually did a measured approach where we have a very large amount of Camry hybrids, because we do think that the Camry hybrid is still ultimately the easiest car for the industry for the drivers to use for now. And then the rest were going to be the BZ 4X that were going to be added over measured parts over the next couple of years. And then the Fisker opportunity came up. And obviously, that gave us the ability to bring a car to the market that was significantly cheaper than anything else, which allows us to bring cars to the rental market that are far below anybody else on the market right now, which gives the driver the ability to learn with a much, much lower rental price than really anything that's out there available. And it'll offset kind of the maybe downtime or learning curve that they would have, whether they would have versus a traditional EV rental that I think the market price now is somewhere between $500 and $600 a week is the average.
I think what's really interesting about what you're saying right now is that a lot of people who might just, again, like who are just like, oh, there's a Fisker story. I think there's this broader context that a lot of people don't get, where it's like there's an EV mandate in New York City. Right. And just to give you a sense of the size of American Lease, you guys are running a 5,000 plus size fleet. And so, by 2028, whatever if 60% of the fleet or 80% of the fleet, whatever the numbers by 2028 or 2027, this is not just, this is a big investment for you, not only from a financial perspective, but just from an operational, trying to figure everything out. And so this is probably just the only very specific Fisker question, I think, just out of my own personal intrigue. How did this idea even come about? I think that's like a kind of an interesting thing. Did you just read a story, or someone in your team read a story, be like, oh, that'd be interesting to buy all those Fisker? Like, how did that even come about?
We were sitting with the management team, we were sitting having lunch, and we were discussing what car should we buy, because we had a forecast where we would have to purchase roughly 1,500, 2,000 cars this year to keep up with our refresh cycle. And I was sitting and reading about how Henrik Fisker, who founded the company, had listed his home with an asking price that was higher than the market cap of the Fisker Corporation itself. So I said, okay, we'll just buy Fisker. Shot them an email, which wasn't answered, to just info@fiskerinc.com, and didn't hear back. The news only got worse publicly. Shot them another email, got in touch with one of the VPs of sales over there, and it was a long, grueling process through many months and bankruptcy hearings, and we could do a 4-hour podcast on just getting that deal from start to finish to actual close. But ultimately, we got it done, and it just made sense because of the price and the scale of the vehicles. This wouldn't have made sense if it was a 200 or 300 or 400 vehicle purchase. It wouldn't be worth the hassle of kind of taking over a defunct car company. But when you're doing it by the thousands, and you have that scale, and you have the ability to justify making parts and importing bankrupt car company inventory from a warehouse in Austria, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So it was a very interesting, long, drawn-out saga that we finally got to completion. And even then, we started really bringing the cars in last August in volume. It took us up until 3-4 weeks ago to finally get everything in place where we had parts to be able to support the car, the knowledge base, the appropriate amount of former Fisker engineers behind the scenes working on the technology and the cloud connectivity, to really launch it to a place we're comfortable to be able to support our customers.
And just to give people a size of the bet, just so people understand, this is not like, to your point, it's not like you bought 10 Fiskers and you're messing around. From my estimate, if let's say it's been widely reported that it's like 3,000 plus Fisker Oceans that you've acquired. And just as a kind of a funny factoid, I think there's only been 10,000-ish ever produced. So, this is just so people understand, this is a massive kind of investment and undertaking. And so So it's just kind of interesting. So moving on to the kind of roading these cars, like getting them ready for New York City Uber taxi, like New York City taxi driving. Um, was this like, did these cars come to you like ready to go, or were they kind of like they needed X amount of investment, or how did you go from, shipping it from was it just shipped from Austria and then you're like, okay, like, TLC played it, license it, get it out to a driver, or was it like you had to do warranty work, you had to configure the software, you had to build operational infrastructure, like, you know, how did you go about that?
Sure. So it was a combination. The vast majority of the cars were here and brand new, so there was no work that needed to be done per se on the car, aside for 3 recalls. One was software related, two were hardware related. Correct, we did have to basically take over that recall deployment process from the car company because there was no company anymore, and we still have to complete all the recalls before the cars can be used, especially for commercial use. So that was a big part of it. Um, they needed to be updated, which we were able to do majority over the air. They needed to have a water pump replaced on the car, which we did locally. We had to wait for those parts to come in. Most of the cars were here in the US, but they were scattered all over. So we were bringing in thousands of cars from California and Baltimore and Georgia. They were mostly aggregated at the ports, but there were some at Odessa sales lots. There were some sitting on defunct dealerships that had to be picked up. There were, I think, 500 or 600 yes, no, 500 or 600 had to be shipped in from Belgium. So it was like herding cats from all over the world and getting them all centrally located into New
And
York.
just so this is super interesting, and just so people know, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Fiskers were made at the Magna Steyr factory in Austria. So they were using kind of a third-party manufacturer. There wasn't like a Fisker manufacturing plant. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I was actually at the factory last August, which was really cool. They were made in Austria at Magna Steyr in Graz, on the same plant that makes the G-Wagon, and was actually made on the same line that's making the Toyota Supra and the BMW Z4. So,
Huh.
in order, like BMW, Toyota, Fisker, that's how the line was going with all the robots that were putting things together. Very cool experience being able to see the auto line.
And so like with that, like and this is kind of getting into the parts that like how you're thinking about, okay, like obviously there's a car company, a car that's not being made anymore. So a question a lot of people might have is like, well, what if you need a spare part? What if you need all of these things? Is the way you're managing that like, okay, there might be a warehouse with spare parts, but can Magna still make Fisker Ocean spare parts because they belong to other cars that they make? Is that the way to think about it?
The car was mostly a conglomeration of different third-party manufacturers, and Magna's primary function was, aside for the body panels, which they did make, was really to assemble the car. So there are, computer ECUs that were made in China and then shipped to Austria for that. There was a different manufacturer that was making the auto glass. There was a different manufacturer that was making the tires. Brembo was making the brakes. So there, the long-term strategy is a combination of the spare parts that were created already for future production, as well as manufacturing some aftermarket things like body panels, as well as some of the OEM manufacturers that will do additional runs of spare parts as needed. And there are a fair amount of spare parts out there already that were made because the car was really built to produce 45,000 units a year on the line. So the complicated parts, the computer modules, things like that, they had ordered tens of thousands of pieces of equipment to be installed in the cars. We have a working relationship with the surviving trust entity in Austria that is still involved in the sales and distribution of the spare parts, which is for now going to be a major source of the inventory that we're using to replace things as they break in the cars.
So basically, if someone asks, like, someone might be listening to this, whether it's a fleet, a national fleet, or enterprise rent a car might be listening to this, podcast and being like, how are they even going about this? Basically, with services challenges, especially from a parts perspective, you have figured it out via the pre-existing Fisker third-party manufacturing network, because originally they were going to make 45,000. So there's enough capacity to service whatever they ultimately produced. And then the last question I have related to this before we move on to like, what's the experience, I think where people are going to get super interested in like, what's been the practical experience is a lot of cars these days generally have like software updates. You know, like there's a bug in the software, you got to update the software, you know, all of that stuff. Is it fair to say that you've basically you've been able to facilitate those software updates essentially?
So the car, right before the final bankruptcy decisions of Fisker itself, there was a recall that was pushed out on a software basis for a large amount of the modules in the car. That remedy was already published prior to the company ceasing to function, even as a bankrupt entity. We, together with our technology partner, hired a large number of the former Fisker staff, the engineers and the people that were working on the cloud portal. And they've really been the ones managing this for us. For now, the system kind of is what it is. Any future updates are tough to you really have to evaluate them one at a time. You can't just like say like, oh, I want to change something in a car. These were, you know, like homologated software items that were signed off by NHTSA, right? That had safety regulation and tests that were performed. So there are things that will be able to you know, change the car in the future as far as like, you know, maybe user experience or the UI and the software, but the core driving functions really are what they are, and they're, you know, they can't be modified from a legal perspective.
Fair enough. Okay. That's super interesting. So, okay, getting into kind of the heart of, okay, you bought all these Fiskers, right? That's all, you know, you're making the infrastructure, you're doing all of this different type of stuff. Of the, what percent of the Fiskers that you bought are now roaded on the streets of New York City and being driven, like roughly?
So I think we just crossed over roughly 800 Oceans on the road. We don't have all of them plated, right? Not all of them have gone through TLC yet. We still have a large volume because I don't have that many permits. But we're, you know, we're looking to do the first deployment of roughly 1,000 cars, put them on the road, have them run for a few quarters, make sure the drivers are happy. We're not seeing any, you know, kind of bugs. We're not seeing any kind of complaints that are coming in about, you know, any one particular thing. Look for patterns of potential problems. So far, so good. And once that happens, we will then continue to defleet some of our older gas cars. All the permits that we used for these Oceans were all originally gas permits. These weren't any EV permits, or these weren't any of the, you know, new issue of the last 10,000 that came out. So we're actually defleeting ICE cars to put these on the road. So we were going to put these out as well as the BZs that we have permit, sure that the charging infrastructure is sufficient for our customers, make sure that they're finding success with these, that they're making money, that they're not struggling every single day to figure out how to find charging or make the rent payments. Hopefully that continues to be successful. So far, the feedback's been very good. And then we'll continue to roll more in over the next 12 to 16 months.
And so is your, now I want to touch on the BZ as well, like kind of include the BZ in this conversation too. So you have 800-ish Fiskers on the road right now, and you know, you'll ramp that up. How many, I think this is, people are going to find this interesting. How many BZs do you have on the road? Because I think you also have a similar, I could be wrong on that, a similar number of BZs on the road too.
No, we have significantly less, and I'll say that the Oceans have hurt the BZ sales, right? We've kind of internally cannibalized some of these cars. They're priced the same. They're still the most affordable electric vehicle rental in New York by far. But the Ocean looks a little bit cooler, and the range is a little bit better, and the sunroof is a little bit nicer. I happen to love the BZ. I think it drives very well. It's a very like sturdy, familiar car. It feels like you're driving a Toyota. I'm a huge fan of the BZ. The BZs we have are also not the ones that you're constantly seeing in the news where people are complaining it takes forever to charge. There's an all-wheel drive BZ and a front-wheel drive BZ.
And just on this point,
yeah.
what you're referring to, for the people who don't know, there was recently, I guess it was in the news, like a protest for drivers in front of, I think it was Toyota Manhattan, where you said people were saying you lied about the range and all of that stuff. Like, could you speak to? I know you had a take on that.
The range and the charging speed. So the all-wheel drive BZ has a battery that charges 50% slower than the front wheel drive BZ, and the range is not great. So there were a lot of Uber drivers or Lyft drivers or TLC drivers that bought these BZs in the rush to grab the available diamonds from the last tranche release, and they're having terrible struggles with the car. It can take up to an hour and a half to 2 hours to fully charge the car in the winter. Sometimes when it gets cold, it doesn't want to charge at all. The range could be as low as like 120, 130 miles, I've read. So that's, that's a very difficult thing for a driver to have to live with on a daily basis.
Just on the range, like how does the Fisker, like just on performance versus performance, how does the Fisker Ocean compare to the BZ? The BZs, if I'm hearing you right, you have the front wheel
The
drive version.
right, the front wheel drive BZs have a max published range of 258 miles. The Oceans have a max published range of 360 miles. But with all EVs, weather plays a tremendous factor into that, as does driving style, as does air conditioning or heat in the car. So the more moderately driver will drive the car, and the more moderately they'll use the air conditioning or the climate control, and how cold or hot it is outside will greatly affect the range of the car. So I would say that the Ocean real world driving probably has something around the 280 to 300 mile range, and I think the BZ real world driving is around the 230, 240
Oh,
mile range.
so it's like much closer than what otherwise
It's
would
much
be
closer
on the
versus
way.
right versus like an all-wheel drive BZ, which has a max published range of like 205 miles, but in reality, you're in the hundreds every single time you're
So
driving the
for
car.
the drivers that you got like this, so this is kind of multiple questions that have come up in my mind. So like you said, obviously someone presents you with this interesting Fisker kind of luxury looking car. It is a luxury car and a BZ. For the drivers who like when you present that to a driver, how are the drivers, are most drivers saying, "Oh, I want the Fisker," because I think it's priced relatively the same. You're pricing about $300 a week, which is extremely competitive if people know pricing. And by the way, is that pricing strategy just, well, let me ask the first question. When the drivers who choose not to go to the Fisker but go to the BZ, like what are they say? Why are they making that decision? That's intriguing to me. Like why
There,
do they choose the BZ if it's priced the same?
so there haven't been many, frankly, since we
Okay.
launched them at the same price.
Yeah.
But some drivers just feel the BZ is more comfortable. It's a much more traditional car experience, and everything looks and feels Toyota. So if you're making the leap from a Camry or a Prius into a BZ, you're not going to have any problem adjusting to the car. The Ocean is very much an EV that was built as an EV, so everything is buried between two or three different menu items and a center screen button push. And some drivers, especially some of the drivers that are less technically inclined, it's just a little bit overwhelming for them. So the BZ is a very easy migration. The Ocean takes a little bit of getting used to, which some drivers, again, just want to stay with what they're comfortable with. And I certainly can appreciate that.
And this is brand new, obviously, you just wrote it all these Oceans. So, if we spoke a year from now, you'd have a lot more, it'd be, a lot more time has passed. But just right now, are you introducing New York City TLC drivers to EV? Like, is the Fisker that you're giving them the first EV they've ever driven? And does that get you nervous? Like, okay, I gave them this kind of luxury EV, and now they're gonna kind of, destroy these cars and then return them to me all, busted up. Like, how are you screening, or like how are you going about that? Or it's just like whoever comes in, as long as they got a license, you give them the car.
Well, we have our underwriting process that we run regardless of the vehicle they're selecting, right? So to be able to be accepted by the insurance policy, the vast majority of people are driving an EV for the first time. Most people love it. I don't know if you've personally ever driven an EV, but it's, especially when you're driving in low speed New York City traffic, it's very pleasant driving.
Well, I love it. I love it from a personal perspective, no doubt about it.
Right.
I've not driven it as a taxi or Uber driver. And, but anyways, continue. Yeah, yeah.
But they have kind of the same reaction, right? Like now you can mostly shift to one pedal drive. It's kind of it's a little faster, but it's also a little bit more of a relaxed drive. You don't have any noise. It's nice driving an EV. It's a pleasant experience. Um, it's a weird looking car. I think it's really cool. It's probably the most unique looking New York City taxi since the Checker, right? So customers are having a really positive reaction to it. I think you sat in the car, most of them have these big panoramic sunroofs and like it's really comfortable back seat. So the positive feedback that the drivers are getting right away kind of encourages them. They do have more access to higher tier revenue on these trips because they qualify for comfort electric. So they're 2 tiers up from your standard ICE vehicle. And again, that's something that we get a lot of positive feedback about. But most people are trying it for the first time. And I'm personally shocked. I was expecting like a 20, 30, 40% return where people are coming back and saying, this is not for me. I'd rather drive a Camry. And we haven't seen that. We're single digit returns where people are coming in and asking for an ICE car again. People are making the transition very quickly, and I'm happy to see it.
No, that's super interesting. And on the pricing strategy, because I think for our TLC viewers, they'll be like, multiple fleets have reached out to me. It's like no one can compete with American Lease right now. There's this 300 per week. I think the Fisker Originals MSRP was like 40,000, 50,000 plus.
70.
Okay, 70. I'm wrong on that. Okay, 70,000 plus at 300 a week is just an incredible deal. Is the pricing strategy, obviously some of that strategy is related to the buy-in price that you managed to get these cars at, but is the pricing strategy just about, we just want to road as many of these as possible and, start this kind of experiment going? Like, how are you thinking about pricing that? Because that's a hard price to compete with.
So we don't want anyone to compete with our price. It's really based on the purchase price of the car, which was the strategy into doing this deal in the first place. We started with the BZ, and even with the price that Toyota gave us, we have a very close OEM relationship with Toyota. They gave us a very competitive purchase price for the BZs, and even with some monetization of the EV credits, it's still, any way you slice it, a significantly more expensive car than a comparable ICE car. It makes it very difficult to rent that car at a competitive price. Knowing that we needed to make this transition to EV, that was something that we were laser focused on, which was finding EVs that are competitively priced. And we started looking at the used market and some of the EVs that Hertz started offloading. And then this kind of happened at the same time as we were making that analysis. So it was perfect. We're very happy to have a price that makes the transition, which is difficult for our customers. It's difficult for TLC drivers to drive an EV in New York City, right? The price component makes it a little bit more palatable, and it kind of softens the blow of the time and the energy that they're going to have to put into successfully driving an EV, which is substantial. It's a real learning curve, and it's a real spend of time, right? So even if they're charging once every 2 days, what was a 5-minute fuel top off for them is now potentially half an hour, hour and a half of their valuable time spent sitting at a charger. So we wanted to have something that could offset that and kind of make the whole transition worth it for them.
And actually, it's a perfect transition to like my charging question I have. So a lot of people in New York, I think there's only, and correct me if I'm wrong, Revel has done a great job in bringing along online a lot of fast charging. But in New York, there's still like 300 fast charge. There's not more than 300 fast chargers in New York. And obviously people who are from New York understand this, but people here, especially TLC drivers, don't have home garages that often. So the fast charging infrastructure is important. As you onboard all these EVs, I could imagine a driver saying, I love the Fisker, I love the drive, I love the regenerative braking and like not paying for gas. Are you yet running into people like operationally telling you that I love this car, I love everything about the EVs, but I am wasting 2 hours of my day charging? Like how is that working as you scale up?
I was expecting more of it. The customers are finding a way to adapt. Drivers generally do, right? They're very street smart, and they usually find a way to work something into their routine to make it work for them. And the majority of them have either told me or my staff that like I make sure every time I go to the airport I'm topping off, or I'm doing a trip up to Westchester and there's almost never a line in Westchester on the level 3 chargers up there, or every day I go to have my coffee and I stop at this level 3 charger. So each one kind of builds their own routine around where they live and what trips they take and what their strategy is for charging. Again, I was pleasantly surprised to see how few drivers are coming back with that feedback. I was expecting it was going to be a substantial amount of them, and it hasn't been so far. The drivers, again, are finding a way to make it work. I suspect that the pricing also plays a large part of that, right? Because it's just so cost effective for them that it's kind of worth the extra little bit of aggravation, which again was all part of the strategy of getting these cars.
Just on that, that's super interesting. I totally get what you're saying that, New York City drivers, if they got a good deal, they're gonna hustle and figure it out. As you ramp up more, I guess where I'm an interesting thought I had is that because you're gonna have so many EVs, have you yourself thought like, okay, we ourselves are going to build fast chargers, or is that not something that you want to get into?
No, we definitely are. We actually at multiple properties that we have offices at. We do have open permits. We will be opening up public fast charging. It's just a process that takes anywhere between a year and a half and 3 years in the city for permits and power upgrades. But American Lease can go on record as we will have our own level 3 chargers available for the public for our customers.
And it just yeah, and obviously I'm not going to no one can hold you to this. It's early days, but it would just be dedicated to your customers. It wouldn't be like some random guy with an EV can just stop in at American.
No. It will absolutely be public facing level 3 chargers.
Absolutely. Wow. Okay, that's very, very interesting. And before I forget, you have I think 4 locations in New York. I think your headquarters are in the Bronx, and then you have LIC.
Bronx, Brooklyn, Long Island City.
Okay, so you have, if you even build just the truck, that you could obviously have access to other properties, but just if you had built it within the properties you have right now, there'd be 4 locations. So that's super interesting. So I guess with the BZs and the Fiskers and the EV transition, I think an interesting question, or not like a lot of people might say, like, how come they didn't buy any Teslas? I don't know why I feel like someone would ask that. Like, how come? Because you can get a Model Y, a used Model Y right now for pretty good price, because I know Hertz was offloading a lot. Maybe that deal doesn't exist anymore. Do you have a view on like if Teslas work well as New York City rideshare cars, or is that something maybe? I feel like, I guess where I'm trying to get at is I feel like you've experimented with Teslas, but maybe they didn't perform as you thought they would.
So when I was with Fast Track, we had done a pilot program with some Teslas, and the uptake rate was really not great. The cars were much more expensive, and there was even less charging infrastructure. That was the extent of my exposure with Tesla. Teslas are really well built. A lot of issues I know about that come up with suspension and tires. I know people suffer terribly that could be replacing tires multiple times a week, especially in the winter when the potholes are bad. That was a consideration when we chose this car. We wanted something that was more of an SUV with a higher tire profile, so people wouldn't be dealing with the same blowouts and bubbles in their tires, which is really the biggest problem with driving an EV in New York City. It's a heavy car driving around on some of these very choppy roads. Otherwise, in the future we might work with Tesla. Thus far we didn't, just because we couldn't get to an agreement on price when we were looking at the BZ versus comparable Teslas. And again, just the construction of the car, the BZ is a little bit more of a sturdy, well-built vehicle for the industry.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I want to transition to kind of insurance and physical damage, but there's one last question I have. So we spoke about the customer facing experience. So, the drivers are liking the Fiskers or how they're experiencing it. From a fleet management perspective, obviously, you have an infrastructure running a fleet. How are you managing that from an operational perspective? Like, do you have to train your staff? Do you have to build a new third-party network, or how is it working from a fleet transition and operational perspective when you have many more EVs coming on?
It is a combination of intake of the former Fisker engineers and staff and technicians who were involved in building and maintaining the car, of whom a large volume now work with American Lease or our partners on this project, as well as retraining for all of the shops that are doing the work. So we make sure that we don't have our own shop per se. We don't own our own shop. We have the shops that do the majority of our work. We make sure they're equipped with the diagnostic tools, spare parts, inventory, and training to be able to fix both the BZ and the Ocean, because fixing an EV is really night and day difference versus a traditional ICE car.
And so that perfectly transitions to kind of like insurance and what I call damage management of fleet. So I think where and this better than probably anybody in New York City, obviously if you have a Toyota Camry hybrid and someone rear ends you, you could fix that car same day, turn it around, super easy, massive third-party network, massive availability of parts. If someone rear ends a BZ or a Fisker, uh, is the turn like okay, let's say you have the parts, let's say all of that's there. Are you still having challenges with like, okay, someone rear ends a BZ or a Fisker? Does that take like a week to get that fixed, or is that taking like a similar time
No,
as a
si-
Camry getting rear ended?
similar as long as the parts are all there. And again, some of the machinery is different, and the body shop machinery is going to be a little bit more advanced for cars that are aluminum based, like the Ocean. A BZ is a RAV4 under the skin, just with a electric motor instead of a gas motor. So it's actually very easy to repair that car. But the Ocean is, again, just as long as you have the parts available, it's a relatively easy car to fix.
Okay, no, that's super interesting. And then from an insurance perspective, I know we have a fair amount of people who are kind of insurance, super into insurance who follow us. I know, given you're a large fleet, you have a unique insurance. You have like probably a self-insurance captive. It's, a totally different beast versus like what a smaller fleet or an individual would have. As you think about insuring Fiskers from insuring Fiskers, one could argue, like, how do you think about the insurance angle of Fiskers, let's say from a physical damage perspective? What I mean by that is, let's say someone gets into, like, someone sideswipes a Fisker, and for most cars, because of the nature of how an ICE engine looks, it's not going to total the car. But sometimes if you hit these EVs in certain ways, because the battery pack is on the bottom, you have these weird insurance outcomes where a relatively minor accident might actually be this huge cost. Like, how do you, maybe I'm framing it, but how do you think about that? And have you had experience with that?
Very model specific. So for example, going back to Tesla, Tesla shapes their battery in kind of like a surfboard shape, right? So if you have a bad collision in a weird spot that normally would just be a fender bender, now the battery cells are punctured and the car is a total loss. Both the BZ and the Ocean have traditional battery packs that sit in between the frame under the car. So you really have to get into a severe accident to be able to impact that battery. And yeah, at that point, it's going to be a total loss, especially the battery really cost more to replace than we paid for the vehicle ultimately. So the sensitivity to total loss is always a component of the value of the damage versus the value of the vehicle. Because the cars were purchased a little bit lower than normal market, you would just have a higher ratio when the car got into an accident. But the repair process, the analysis, subrogation, all that is handled in the standard way.
And then also, like, I don't know what the weight of the Fisker Ocean, because EVs tend to be heavier cars that could be, what is the weight of an Ocean?
It's around 4,800 pounds. It's
Okay,
about
so it's not insanely heavy, but more like a
it's
big SUV.
right. It's roughly 1,000 pounds heavier than a comparable ICE car would be at that size.
Got it. So like in New York City, like obviously some, very famously, some insurance claims, especially fraudulent claims, can come from a pedestrian accident or stuff like that. It's kind of a weird, maybe very insurance specific question. Do you see any indication that the EVs are causing like more serious injuries with pedestrians or bicyclists when they're hit by an EV, or not really?
Knock on wood, so far we haven't had any. Thank you, Dawood, for asking that question. Um, but no, I mean, if anything, we've seen lower severity of accidents that have occurred so far with the Oceans and the BZs because these cars have so many sensors, as well as like that auto panic that'll kick in that it's managed, I think, to avoid some of the heavier impacts or rear ends because of all these ADAS sensors all over the car. So hopefully that continues and that trend will be the way it is in the future. But these are not like, I think the weight issue that's come up with insurance in the past was really combination of weight and size. So you have these like Suburbans and Navigators that have these really high hoods and you can't see over them, and you have blind spots in the car. You don't really have that with the BZ or the Ocean because it's kind of a high riding, really open SUV, so the visibility is great.
The other reason I asked that, and then we'll move on to another topic, is that right now it's like the Tesla Model Y, everybody knows this is the most popular EV amongst individual drivers. And there's basically no availability of comp and collision insurance for that car right now. And so I think a lot of people in the insurance industry, and I've spoken to a lot, I'm sure you've even spoken to more than I have, they're just having, maybe it's nervousness, maybe they don't want to be the first mover, in this thing, where there's concerns about how does one insure in EV, especially from a comp and collision side. But what you're seeming to say is that it's really vehicle build dependent, like how the battery pack is placed, and the fact that you have a self-insurance captive, you can kind of monitor that risk and self-insure in a much more unique way than maybe individuals can. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, us and I believe all fleets of size in this industry, really all fleets in livery to begin with, usually self-insure collision because it's just not cost effective to carry full coverage on these cars. Anecdotally, just from working with some other outside models, even for a regular retail customer to insure a Rivian, for example, in New York City is astronomically expensive. So it really depends on the the actuarial future damage outlook based on each model. I see wild swings between like a BZ, which is on the cheaper end, to a Tesla, or a Rivian, which is really on the higher end, because again, you have these minor accidents that can turn into five-figure and more losses or total losses without much actually happening in terms of collision.
So it's
So
it's fair to say that you're not losing sleep, like what, as you onboard these EVs, a thing that's making you're not losing sleep over is like the insurance element of this. You're pretty comfortable with how an EV fleet compares to an ICE fleet from an insurance perspective. That's not like a barrier
no,
preventing
not at all.
you from adopting EVs.
It's just a car. And again, had I paid the retail price for these cars, I probably would be feeling differently if I had paid 60 or $70,000 for the car. But at the end of the day, a car is a car, and if you can fix it, you can fix it. And again, once you're self-insuring, it doesn't really make a difference what kind of model it is. You just have to make sure that you have the ability to repair the car and do it in a cost-effective, time
Fair
efficient.
enough. Okay, well, now I want to get into, we just have a few more topics, and thanks all for taking the time to do this. Is that financially, like when you think about, obviously, like an ICE, there's just fleet economics where you're aiming for a margin. Obviously, scale helps you hit different, you just have a different margin profile if you have more scale in a fleet. Are margins for a all ICE fleet or all hybrid ICE fleet kind of the same as an all EV fleet, or do you actually with time see like an all EV fleet will have actually structurally higher margins?
I think an all EV fleet over time has significantly lower margins.
Lower margins. Okay.
Significantly so. It is much more difficult to operate an EV fleet. Um, Thus far, no company of scale has really done it profitably. All you see are stories like what happened to Hertz in the news, right? So between the bottoming out on the used vehicle side, right? So your assets all of a sudden take this terrible depreciation hit after year one, to the availability of parts, to the sensitivity of accidents where so many sensors can be affected by what was, to your point, a simple bumper change in a Camry before. It's significantly more difficult to run an EV fleet, which again was one of the reasons why we did this deal. We were doing it at scale. The purchase price of the car was low enough to make sense. I think it's going to be the challenge for the entire industry as we get closer to 2030, both for fleet operators and for owner operators, to really pick the right vehicle, which I don't think is really in the market yet, to be able to have like that next Camry of the EV market.
What do you think needs to happen? Like, what is that, right? Like, if you could, like,
If
talk
I could design my own
exactly.
EV, it would be something like the Ocean, an SUV of that size with a similar range, with maybe a little bit less power, right? Because the car is very fast, which affects the range and affects the efficiency of it, right? Something a little bit slower, with a little bit more of a utilitarian interior, right? That was really built to stand up to long-term commercial use. I would there are some models that are coming out. I think the battery technology has a long way to go. Again, we're in the part of the EV game right now where longer range means significantly higher cost, right? So that's something that has to change for a model to become really viable for this use. I think that Toyota's next generation of solid state batteries could potentially be a game changer. But what needs to change is cost of the battery, range, and then time to recharge. Those are the three things that are
I
critical.
find that so interesting, your take on that, because like you said, very famously, Hertz's EV bat kind of blew up, basically related to residual values, related to even a little bit of a demand with it. And so I guess it's fair to say is like, the mandate, which is we spoke about at the top of the top of the podcast, is that it's for you, I guess, or for American Lease, it's not about yes, like it's a kind of a funny thing. It's like running an all gas fleet has a better margins, but because we need to do this, it is what it is, and we got to figure out how to make that transition. And so the real honest take is for the next couple of years, we expect lower margins, but over time, as battery technology, as more models come out, as better models come out, as et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, gets better, would you expect the margin to swing back higher, or do you just fundamentally expect a lower margin, or it's just too hard to tell?
It is too hard to tell. I think fundamentally over time, unless the market rate for rentals and leases significantly goes up, which would really only happen from drivers earning significantly more money, which would really only happen from customers being charged significantly more money, right? Which then affects utilization. So this whole delicate balance, right? So I don't know if that happens, but what we do know is over time, the cost of vehicles continues to go up, right? So if your base rent is staying flat or whatever, close to flat is going to be, and the price of vehicles are going to go up, and even if an EV comes to market that's more cost efficient than the ones they are now, they will still be more expensive than the ICE and hybrid vehicles. That's
and
for
like
sure.
and to that point, I think it's a very important point. Like if the drivers are making more money, then you can charge higher, and then the economics get more attractive. Just on like a very New York City policy perspective, like uh how do you think, like I'm sure the regulator is very big on, they want an EV transition. So I'm sure when they see someone like a huge fleet adopting all these EVs, that's very exciting for them. But at the same time, you also have this you have to have this kind of discussion with them, or just say, hey, listen guys, we're trying to onboard all these EVs, but you need to make policies that will make driver earnings go up and stuff like that. Do you have a view on like how they can solve for that, or like kind of basic policy that they can do?
I think that whenever I start to hear about policy, I always worry about demand, right? So I think there's a certain point, and Uber is tremendously expensive as a consumer. Taking an Uber in New York City right now is tremendously expensive to the point of it's already starting to make you think like, is it really worth it? Should I just drive, right? Do I even need to go there in the first place? When you continue to push prices up to a certain point, you start to have people start to make these decisions, and that's what pushes down demand. So I think whatever policy the city chooses to enact should keep in mind both the driver's supply and their ability to earn money, as well as the demand side, which has to stay strong in order for the drivers to be compensated fairly. And it's really a symbiotic relationship. You can't just throw a bunch of extra fees onto a trip and say, okay, no problem, that's going to go to the drivers, because again, at some point, there will be an effect on the top line demand. I see us being there right now. I think we're kind of really at the max of what people for Uber trips. And hopefully that is yielding enough for the customers to make and continue to make a comfortable living. But it's a constant tightrope and balancing act, I think.
So can the regulator, like if the regulator perhaps is listening to this, is there anything they can do? And when I say regulator, it's even beyond the Taxi and Limousine Commission, it can be the state of New York, can be New York City. Is there anything that they can do to help fleets like yourself transition to EVs, or it's more like, is there any policy that like, I wish they would just do this, or is just more on a high level, like, if you add a $2.50 or $1.25 additional congestion surcharge and not think that that's not going to hit demand and hit driver earnings and, yada, yada, yada? Or do you have any specific kind of thoughts on that?
My wish would be that for it to be a constant dynamic and inclusive analysis that goes on throughout the year. We're in such a dynamically changing industry where from quarter to quarter, revenue and income streams and the amount of people that come into New York in the summer versus the amount of people that come in January and February, I think really sensitive and very specific analysis has to be done and have to keep on being done without any blanket edicts being given out, because what works one month can be really hurting people the next month. And I think policy should be something that's constantly under review and constantly being adjusted to the changes that are always happening in New York City on a seasonal basis, on a year-to-year basis, as things change in the auto market, as things will change in the EV market, right? So that would really be my message to anybody that's listening to it, that's on really either side of policymaking. Just keep on talking to each other in a productive, healthy way, and keep on looking at the changes as they're happening, and really speak to what I like to do is really speak to my customers. I like to speak to drivers. What's happening on the ground? I think that's what sometimes people lose sight of, is like, what are the drivers actually experiencing? What are they, they'll tell you anecdotally what they feel if it's busy, and that's usually what's happening, right? It'll take months and months and months of data analysis to come up with what's actually happening later. But by then you're already 6 months or a year later, and a lot of times people have been suffering during that time period.
And to that point, like anecdotally, just like on a high level, what percentage of, like, you have like 5,000 plus drivers driving all of your cars. If you force them all to take EVs, do you think, like, what percent do you think, okay, I'll try this out? Or like, would you say the majority of TLC drivers are now open to trying an EV, or is it kind of still most are hesitant because of charging, for example? Like, how do you view that?
I think that our plan is to stay roughly 50 to 60% for the next couple of years, see what the intake rate and what the retention rate is like for drivers. Again, so far we're 2-3 months into a very heavy push, and we're starting to see real numbers on the road. The feedback's been great, but again, like with any other project or new business, this is the early adopters that are stepping in and trying something, and these are always the people that are a little more receptive to doing something differently. Um, uh, we'll see. I think it's a little bit too soon to be able to answer that question.
Got it. No, fair enough. And okay, just to wrap up here, and is that if, let's say there's another big, let's say across the country, I think a lot of people will, number one, find your bet on Fisker interesting, but also just say, whoa, okay, here, like Hertz, Hertz was obviously they're a gigantic fleet, but you're a very sizable fleet. You're in New York City. There's all these things going on. Are you at a point now where you can say, if another fleet, let's say in Los Angeles, is saying, oh, well, American Lease did that in New York City, why don't I buy, 500, BZs and try it over here? Is there any like advice you would give them upfront, or are you still in the advice kind of, you're not even at a point where advice can be given? Like, is there any obvious lessons you've learned thus far? Low-hanging fruit lessons?
Well, you want me to give away the secret sauce, but just
Well, not the secret. Don't give away your strategy, but
no,
I mean,
you like anything else with fleet, you really have to control your own destiny and be completely vertically integrated. There can't be places where you're looking to third parties to do work for you that aren't completely under your control or guidance. There can't be whether it's parts or whether it's insurance. So you have to really have every facet of the business from top to bottom completely planned out, budgeted for, and ready before you start operating EVs. Because when things do break, it's an entirely new experience. And I've seen from multiple fleets where whether it's an auto repair that the car has been sitting for 2 or 3 months, or whether it's a fight they're having with an insurance policy on a subrogation claim, that things can go very bad very quickly, and you just really have to know your fleet and know your models very well, and have that all buttoned up before you launch any kind of large scale, especially for commercial use EV fleet.
Got it. Okay, 2 last questions. One's kind of out of left field questions, and it can be a very short answer. I know it's a gigantic question. What are your thoughts? I think just being a huge fleet, like, what are your like high level thoughts on AVs, like Waymos and all of those things coming up? Is that something that's on your mind right now?
Oh,
or
yeah.
is it kind of like, well, okay, yes, it's real, but what can I do at this moment?
No, I mean, it's so as part of this, as part of the different things that were happening with Fisker, excuse me. As part of the different things that were happening with Fisker, I was out in San Francisco meeting some of the former staff, and I took my first Waymo, and it was excellent. It was not at all what I expected. It was better than I expected. It took a longer route to get me to where I was going. It hesitated by some intersections that were crowded, but it's real. It's coming. I find it super cool and exciting, personally speaking. What that's going to mean for the industry long term here, I think, is the next chapter, and then really the next adventure. I think that what ultimately happens is that it'll be a slow transition, and I think owner operators will have a future where they could potentially monetize their permits by owning their own AVs that are being dispatched. All that is kind of far out in the future. The one thing that no commercial AV company has done yet is come into a climate like ours. There's a reason they're all in Texas and California. There's no technology out there that's tested in the fog and the rain and the snow that we get. So I think we're a ways out. They're not really even trying to come into this market yet. I think we're a ways out from that being tested, but it is coming. It's very cool, and it's coming sooner than we think. And the entire industry is going to have a seismic shift when it does. Absolutely.
I think this is super interesting take coming from someone like you, because you're basically saying the technology is real. You're not denying it. You're just saying that it might not be next year that, like, you know, you have 5,000 Waymos in New York City, but if you wake up 10 years from now, like, you know, it could be a
I'd be
different world.
surprised if there was a single non-AV car still on the road in 10 years from now. That would shock me more than cars coming in a year from now.
No, that's very interesting. Okay, well, Josh, the last question I have for you is for the drivers who are listening, or for even like fleet owners or manufacturers or insurance companies are interested. How do they like reach out to you? What's an easy way to get in touch with you? You know, how
Sure.
do they reach out to you?
Anybody
And
can
I can
email
put
me
this
anytime.
in the description in the YouTube as well.
Yeah, Josh at AmericanLease.net. If anybody would like to reach me, always happy to speak to symbiotic companies and businesses that are involved in the EV space, and would love to hear from you.
Perfect. Well, Josh, thanks a lot for your time. Super interesting insight. And maybe if you're up for it, maybe a year and a half or a year from now or 2 years from now, we
Sure.
can, you know, do this again. So thanks a lot.
Anytime. Thank you, Doug. Good speaking to you.